Thursday. Welcome to OsteoBytes. My name is Christina Iptoma, and I am mom to OsteoAngel Dylan and Director of Scientific Programs at MIB Agents. And today on OsteoBytes, we are talking with Dr. Volchenboum about transforming the way researchers share data as he shares lessons from the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons. Thanks so much, Dr. Volchenboum, for joining us on OsteoBytes today.
Thanks.
We're thrilled to have you. And we're also very happy to be joined by our panelist, Kara Skrubis, who is an osteo warrior extraordinaire and also president of our MIB Junior Advisory Board. A little bit more about our guest today. Dr. Volchenboum is an associate professor of pediatrics and the associate chief research informatics officer for the Biological Science Division at the University of Chicago. He is the dean of master's programs, and he designed and launched the University of Chicago Masters in Biomedical Informatics. His clinical specialty is pediatric hematology oncology, caring for kids with cancer and blood diseases. His research group includes the University of Chicago's Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, a group dedicated to liberating and democratizing international data for pediatric malignancies. He's the director of the Informatics Core with the Clinical and Translational Science Award, and he's director of the University of Chicago Clinical Informatics Fellowships Program. You wear many hats, and I know you've been traveling a lot too, so thank you so much for making time for us in your busy schedule.
Happy to be.
So yeah, welcome, and welcome to everyone joining us today. Please feel free to add any questions that you have for Dr. Volchenboum during the talk to either the chat or the Q&A, and we will make sure that we share those. And before we get started, I just have a couple of announcements. We have a new monthly newsletter called Connective Issue. It includes lots of info of interest to our osteosarcoma community, including recent news and papers, open clinical trials, job postings. In fact, there is a job posting at the PCDC with Dr. Volchenboum's group, and info about MIB events and programs, spotlights on members of our community. And our second issue just went out yesterday. And I'll put a link to it in the chat. And if you'd like to just get it directly in your inbox every month, just go to our website and hit join our community to subscribe. And for anyone in the Houston area, we will be heading your way next month. Join us on November 30th for MIB Mingle at the Blossom Hotel, which is right next to MD Anderson campus. And everyone in the osteo community is invited. Patients, caregivers, doctors, researchers. We'll be sending out an invite with more info, and I'll put an email address in the link if you want more information. And then I'd like to thank the sponsor of our episode, BTG Specialty Pharmaceuticals. BTG provides rescue medicines typically used in emergency rooms and intensive care units to treat patients for whom there are limited treatment options. They're dedicated to delivering quality medicines that make a real difference to patients and their families through the development, manufacturing, commercializations of pharmaceutical products. Their current portfolio of antidotes counteracts certain snake venoms and the toxicity associated with some heart and cancer medications. And their drug Raxase is for high-dose methotrexate toxicity. So Kara, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kara Skrubis. I am 21. I'm from upstate New York. I was diagnosed with osteosarcoma in my left tibia in January of 2020. I underwent 9 months of chemotherapy, a left above the knee amputation, and then 8 more months of immunotherapy. And now I serve as the 2022 Junior Advisory Board President.
Okay, well, thanks, Kara. Thanks, Christina. It's really great to be here. This is meant to be an open discussion. So if anybody wants to share or ask a question anywhere along the way, please break in and let's talk about it. So and you can also put questions in the chat, and we can get to those in time too. So I'm a pediatric oncologist at UChicago, and for the past 7 years or so, I've been working to build a research group that helps researchers share data. And I'm hoping to use the talk today to tell you about our platform and specifically what we're doing around bone cancers, and hopefully generate some interest from you guys to ask some questions. You know, pediatric cancer is a rare disease, and rare disease suffer from the siloing of data and manual processes and how we collect data, and really importantly, a lack of standards. And it really makes it hard to ask research questions when you don't have the most basic ways of combining and sharing data together. Pediatric cancer is incredibly rare, thankfully. It's only about 1% of adult cancers. And so we'll only see about 15,000 cases of cancer in the US every year. And so for any particular subtype of pediatric cancer, that just means we only get a few hundred cases often, and it makes it really hard to study something where you need thousands of cases. So the idea behind building a commons is to try to put together as many cases as you can so you can actually ask those hard questions. Medicine is still using so many manual processes. Clinical trials are written in Microsoft Word, and we send them around as PDFs, and people have to manually take stuff out of these with copy and paste. It's really a painful, horrible process. We still write things by hand and shadow charts. We still have to connect to each individual pharmaceutical company's own system and use their system and copy, paste values into there. It's a terrible way to collect data, and a lack of standards is at the heart of a lot of what these problems are. I like to say that a lack of standards is now the standard, because here's an example of collecting age from a registry, and these are all the ways people put age in there. And there's so many different ways it's represented here. How can you possibly combine data when we can't even agree on something as simple as how you collect a variable like age? We have an enormous amount of loss from what I call the clinical trials funnel. So in a clinical trial, if you want to collect how someone's heart is working, we collect something called the ejection fraction or the shortening fraction. But that came from an incredibly rich set of data. Came from a report, which came from an echocardiogram, which came from a video. We don't even collect that stuff. We just collect that one number. Then what does that mean 5 years later when you want to actually study the valves in the heart or something else? Why are we throwing away all this valuable data? Well, we're throwing it away because we don't have good ways to collect it, because it's not standardized. And so getting better ways to do electronic health record extraction of these data can really revolutionize our ability to do research. And then we just lose information in the transfer of data. We were trying to collect reports on CT scans. And what they were doing is they were printing the report, faxing it, and then scanning it and sending it to us as an image. And we had to then take that image and reverse engineer it, using optical character recognition instead of them just sending us the text. So there's an incredible amount of loss just in the process. And we could use modern technologies like something called FHIR, which will allow you to take data right out of the record and send it right to a group like ours so that you don't have this incredible loss. And again, we don't even have the right standards to have that conversation right now. Standards are incredibly important. These are just some examples which you may have heard of. There was a metric conversion problem which led to a jet running out of fuel in the middle of the air. There was a crash of a probe on Mars because they didn't convert their units correctly. And then there was a horrible case where Dennis Quaid's twins, one of them got very sick because they were given the wrong dose of heparin, because those two very similar looking bottles have 1,000 times as concentrated difference between them. Fortunately, his kids are all right, but it led to one of them getting very sick, and it led to this recognition that even something as simple as the colors on the bottles or how we label these things wasn't standardized. So the problem can really be boiled down to, we have a lack of data for rare diseases, which is hindering our research. And let's face it, we have a lack of community around many of these diseases, and we have deficient data standards, which makes a group like MIB Agents so exciting, because there's the community. And once you build the community, then you can start having these other conversations around standardizing data so it can be shared. Researchers just can't make progress until we collect large amounts of data that can be connected together, and that's how we're ultimately going to improve patient outcomes. And our group solves these problems by helping build international groups to come together, creating the common ways of sharing the data, and then building essentially an ecosystem for researchers and doctors to access the data and to study it. So the mission of our group boils down to something very simple. We build communities, platforms, and ecosystems that maximize the potential of data to drive discovery and improve human health. And obviously, this is not a mission statement specific to pediatric cancer, but I think it encapsulates really what we're trying to do when we build these standards and collect these data. The Pediatric Cancer Data Commons has been around for about 7 or 8 years. We like to think now that it's a hub across all pediatric cancers, and that people can study not just within a particular silo, but you could ask questions like, show me all the patients that got doxorubicin and what were their cardiac outcomes across all solid tumors, for instance. We work really hard to build common core data dictionaries, and that's the heart of what we do. Having a common set of dictionaries and a common governance structure is what has allowed us to engender trust and to create these ways to share more and more aggregated data. As I said, we do this with an international network of researchers, and we've really turned our attention now to education and training. We think it's important that people understand why it's important to collect data in a standardized way. Every time somebody just generates a data collection form without thinking about it, they're creating more of a problem. We want people to understand that standards are important. And if you collect data that are standardized from the start, you'll actually make it much easier to do work down the line. So the steps that we've come up with, and I'll touch on each one very briefly, is to build the community, establish the need, build your data operations infrastructure, put a real focus on governance, make it easy to use, socialize it, and create education and training, and then make sure you have a good sustainability model. We really start with the community. This is from our rhabdomyosarcoma commons, and it came from having multiple in-person meetings where we talked about how we could share data. We got people to trust each other. We built out the core research aim so that we knew why we were building it in the first place and what questions we would answer. This led to the establishment of the rhabdomyosarcoma data commons in 2018 because we were able to build this community. I'm a big believer in having a big tent. Every time I try to do one of these new ones, people say, oh, you can't work with so-and-so is going to steal our data, and so-and-so doesn't want to do this. I say invite everybody, get everybody under the tent. Let's have a meeting. Let's talk about all of our goals, because everybody has something that they can teach us. And if we can get everybody working together, then we can actually, in the end, produce something that's better. So we've done this time again. We've had many cases where people say that a particular investigator or group will not want to work together. And every single time the barriers have fallen and people have wanted to engage. Once you have your core group, you define the goals of why you're doing this in the first place, figure out why you're going to collect data. If you can't answer that question, there's no sense in doing it. If we only had more data, this is what we could do with it. And then identify the methods for how you're going to decide who gets to be on the executive committee, who gets to decide what projects are done, who gets to publish the papers, because defining those up front helps with trust and then helps later on down the line when complicated questions come up. This is the membership of our Hibiscus Consortium, our bone tumor consortium that we helped form 2 years ago. I'm sure you'll recognize the names of our co-chairs and the groups that are involved. And having this international group from the start has really helped us in building an international consensus around data standards, and now working to harmonize data from all these groups to put into the data commons. As I said, data dictionary development is the heart of what we do. We used to have many of these meetings in person where we would travel and all meet and sit in a room and argue about the data standards. Now we're relegated to doing that on Zoom, but it's still very effective. And here's where you decide how you're going to combine very different standards from across the world. And it's really important to have these conversations because people need to feel like they have a voice. And it's important that they are part of the development process. Data standards, anybody can build a standard. And so we see tons of them out there that are just not useful. People using ones and zeros for things like male and female, or using M and F. We don't believe that that's a sustainable, scalable way to build a standard. So we link everything to a common data element. We use the National Cancer Institute's thesaurus, but there are many common data element repositories. So once we decide that we're going to have male, female, and unknown as our biologic sex, then we can link to the standards in the NCI thesaurus so that we have an unambiguous way of calling that term later. That's just a code. Don't have to worry about how somebody spells it. Now that becomes very relevant when we look at something like the osteosarcoma dictionary, and we have reason for somebody stopping therapy. There's a very complex list down here that we came to a consensus with our international team. And then we have codes for all of these different factors. In this case, stop therapy because they reached the end of treatment or they completed their treatment. There's so many ways to write that or type that, but now we have an unambiguous code which points to the NCI's thesaurus term so that we don't have to worry about how somebody spells it because the data collection forms can just use those terms. Another example from our osteosarcoma dictionary is the site of disease within the long bone. And these terms, which are obviously very familiar to you, were a consensus that was derived from working with our Hibiscus Consortium. And again, everything here is linked to a term that's in the NCI thesaurus. And if there's not a term available, the NCI has been great about working with us to get those terms added to the database. And of course, we collect data in English, but in other parts of the world, they don't. So how do you tackle a problem like having different languages? And again, having the codes is what solves this problem, because if you have a male, female, and unknown code, those can be then localized to any language. And then you have an unambiguous way of talking about things like biologic sex in this case. All of our dictionaries are open, available, open source. Anybody can get them. They're on our website, and the link is here if you want to download them. We even have draft versions of various dictionaries up there. We want to make sure these are available to anybody who wants to see them. We have also created ways to interconvert between standards because we realize that not everybody uses one particular standard. So if people are collecting data in M-code or in PCORI or in CDISC, we can interoperate between those standards by having a translational layer between our standard and theirs. Once we have the standards, we then tier them so that we know which ones are most important, because the statisticians can't give you everything. So we make sure that we go with the group and say which are the most important, second most important, and so forth. And then the harmonization process is a real bottleneck for us. How do you take these thousands of patients of data and go through and harmonize them to this new standard? That's a very cumbersome, expensive, time-consuming process that the statisticians do for us so that we can get the data in the commons after we put the data through a quality control process. We're very big on governance. We want people to understand that when they put data in the commons, they have some control over what happens with those data. We build these consortia that are based on trust. We know we want to lift barriers to getting data, but we want to make sure people understand that they have ability to control how the data are used. We want to make sure that there's balanced representation from the different groups who put data in. And then we spend a lot of energy working with the international regulations to make sure that we can conform. We've worked with groups from all over the world. We've conformed to HIPAA, GDPR, the UK's new Data Protection Act, and we've been able to work with lawyers to get data sharing agreements in place across any particular set of rules and laws. It just takes persistence and understanding and, again, trust. And so we have data in our data commons from all these groups here. And we've never not been able to get data because we have a regulation expert that just persists in working with these groups to put data in. This is from our website. It shows the various degrees of progress for each of our tumors, each of our tumor types. Bone tumors actually is in its version 2 of Data Dictionary now, is being drafted. We have 9 data contributors that are committed to putting data in the Hibiscus Commons. And hopefully by the hopefully by the middle of next year, we'll have the Commons up and running and have actual data in there for people to search over. We have a lot of data that are committed, and hopefully we'll be able to start using the data for publications very soon.
Yeah, how many cases with those 9 groups do you anticipate for that first?
I have a slide with that I'll.
And I feel like I saw a number somewhere. It's like in the 2000s or something?
Yeah.
That sound about right?
I have to see.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine.
Slow there.
A good question. I needed to take a breath, anyways. I had a number slide somewhere which showed the general.
Well, we can get to it when you get to it. Sorry, I didn't mean for you to.
Okay. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get to it, but it is a couple thousand actually to start with that we'll have. Okay, and remember the link to the slides is at the bottom of every page. So if you want to grab the slides, you can get them. And hopefully, I think I have a number slide, but it is a couple thousand kids that we can get into here immediately with the commitments that we already have. Mm-hmm. The core discovery tool should be really easy to use, and and we've insisted that it be open to the public, that everybody should have access to see what data are in there and who can and search over it. You can't see the actual line level data, but everybody should have access to see what's in there. We built it on the same technology that the Genomic Data Commons is built on, and if we make any changes, it goes back into the code source for anybody else to use. Everything we do is open source and publicly available. It should be very intuitive, and when we build visualization tools, they should be easy to use. And we should be able to adapt it. So if somebody has a more complex data model, we should be able to incorporate it into the commons.
Wait, so sorry, back up on that. So quick question on that. So is that already available? So if I'm a researcher and I wanted to, for example, I was looking into MYC and I wanted to kind of find all the patients that had kind of a MYC amplification, could I kind of easily go in and do that now and kind of see kind of what the breakdown was across diseases and see?
Yeah, so the two that are completely live are neuroblastoma and rhabdomyosarcoma. Okay. And then germ cell tumors coming up next, and then AML and Hodgkin, and hopefully by the middle of next year we'll have osteo up there. And that's the idea, is that you should be able to search over multiple data types with something like MYC or ALK or NPM or something like that. Mm-hmm. So as I'll show right now, we have neuroblastoma and rhabdo that are live. And you know, the limiting factor, I thought the limiting factor was going to be governance, contracts, and data dictionary, but that's not been it. Those are done. The limiting factor has been getting the effort to put the data harmonization in. The data are just sitting there waiting to be harmonized, and it's just finding that effort to do that. That is pretty much standing in the way. But we're starting to generate funds, hopefully, to get statisticians to do this work. Something we're really passionate about is linking to other data sources. And the Children's Oncology Group does something really smart, is that, I mean, they do a lot of smart things, but they give a universal specimen identifier to every patient that connects all their data together. So if you do a search in our data commons and come up with a cohort of patients of, in this case, neuroblastoma, and those neuroblastoma patients have data over in the target database, which is the genomic database, you can actually link, and it'll send you over to that. That'll send you over to that commons and bring open the same cohort of patients. And so, if for our osteosarcoma commons, if there are other sources of data like genomic data somewhere, we'd love to be able to link across those data to link them together. We already have a link to the biospecimen repository. So for most tumor types, you can actually see who has frozen samples in the nationwide children's biorepository. And so we hope to expand the availability of different linkages there.
Oh, so just to make sure I understand, so if there's any genomic data linked to that patient, that lives in the genomic data commons and not in the PCDC?
Right, so the PCDC is clinical data. So we'll take genomic data if there's no other home for it, but we don't want to duplicate things. So genomic data that are collected on NCI-funded projects are supposed to end up in the genomic data commons. And so our hope would be is that we can link to those data through a common identifier, rather than duplicate it. But we've had cases where there's just no other place to put data, like some imaging data that we acquired, and it ultimately should end up in the imaging data commons, but it didn't have a home. So we took it in. We're happy to take the data, but ultimately we want to be the experts on clinical data.
Got it. Thanks.
But I would consider like MYC amplification or MYC mutation a clinical data element. That's a genetic factor, as opposed to the whole exome sequence that was underneath that, which would be, to me, the genomic data. So when you go to the portal, and everybody should try this out. This is for rhabdo and for neuroblastoma right now. You can log in with a Google a Gmail ID, and we don't verify who you are. We just verify that you have an identity. And once you're in, you'll get a page that shows you how many patients are in the commons. At this time, there was 31,651 patients. And then you can just start searching over the patients into the exploration tab. And on the left, you'll see subject, disease, and molecular data, and you'll see all the different facets that are collected. So an example here would be searching over just the neuroblastoma data, the International Neuroblastoma Research Group, versus the Instruct, which is the rhabdomyosarcoma data. And once you select that, it will only search over the INRG data. And then you can look at staging systems. So neuroblastoma, of course, is notorious for changing staging systems a number of times. And as you select the different staging systems, it will show you only the data that are available for patients that had that staging system. In this case, looking at the INSS, the INRG, and the Evans staging system. The other thing, so looking at an example search here, here's looking at patients that have low risk and intermediate risk neuroblastoma, so stage 1, 2, and 3. And you can see the numbers of patients for each of those. And once you select those patients, you can actually save that search, and you can come back to it later. If you log in a week later, you'll have that search saved. So I'm going to call this INSS stage 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. And then likewise, I can do a search for just the stage 4 patients, which are the high-risk patients, and there's 11,400 of those patients. And I can save that search. And the cool thing, not only is cool that you can come back to save searches, but now you can go into the visualization tab. And on the left, you can see that I'm picking the INSS stage 4 against the INSS stage 1 through 3. You can see it on the right here. And then you can immediately get a survival curve showing the difference in survival between low stage and middle risk, intermediate risk neuroblastoma, and high risk. And obviously we know about this incredible disparity in outcomes between the two groups. And this is an extreme example. But the idea is to provide an easy way for researchers to do a quick search and a cohort discovery and generate a hypothesis using these visualization tools. So these are being beta tested right now. They're available in the interface, and you should be able to try them out by going to the portal. The second to last step that we think is really key is the education and engagement step. We, as I said, we feel that we feel like we have a responsibility to train people and understand why collecting data in a certain way is important. But it goes way beyond that. It's not just teaching people how to collect data. It's how do you use the commons? How do you collect data for a project? How do you do your statistical analysis? How do you get young investigators involved? And these things we think are all critically important. So we do this through webinars and through live events like this one, by involving patients and families and having advisory boards. And we hope to increase awareness of the work that we're doing and get more people to appreciate the importance of standards. Here's our external advisory board for the PCDC. And with one or two exceptions, most people here are not involved in pediatric cancer. The idea was to put together a board that was technically diverse so that we could get input from people that don't normally think about cancer or may not even normally think about medicine, so that we could figure out how to do better data sharing with the data that we have around the world. And so this is a great group, but it's obviously very US and European centric, and we hope to expand this to some other parts of the world and bring in some more members over the next year. And then lastly, we want to plan for longevity and sustainability. We're doing this by increasing our numbers and creating pillars around the different factors you see there at the bottom, like infrastructure and standards. But really thinking about the scholarship of what we're doing is critically important for our longevity. What is the science behind data collection? What is the science behind building a data commons? And then we have to investigate alternative funding models. And we're not going to be able to get funding from foundations forever, and we need to figure out how are we going to pay for this in the future, and whether that's going to be investigators that pay for it. Are we going to have pharmaceutical companies pitch in? Are we going to have cooperative groups? It's important that everything is on the table so that we can talk about it, and whatever we decide, have the right governance in place that works for that group that contributed the data in the first place. A few slides about our measurable outcomes. We've had 40 publications since the launch of the PCDC. There's 28 research projects currently in progress. The consortia really become think tanks of the best experts that can tell you which questions need to be answered. And every time we have a consortium meeting now, more and more, there's more and more sharing of incredible knowledge around how are we going to answer these more difficult questions once we have more data. And then we're trying to provide a new opportunity to study disparities, because most of the data we collect is in high-income countries, and areas that are underrepresented, even within those countries, are not well represented in the data set. And so this offers a unique way to study disparities and understand why there are stark differences in survival among different racial groups or different financial groups. Here are two papers that involve studying treatments or improving treatment for kids with cancer. All these papers are linked from our website. This one on the left talks about molecular testing in rhabdomyosarcoma, and the one on the right talks about better risk stratification at the time of diagnosis. Here's a paper on looking at surgical management, so doing a big review of all the patients in the commons by Dave Roderberg led this paper with all the patients in the data commons about the type of surgery. This is part of our germ cell tumor consortium. This is looking at neuroblastoma and germ cell tumor treatment strategies and what the outcomes are and how to improve those treatments. And then this was a really cool paper that a group published on using deep learning to look at images to try to predict outcomes at diagnosis. And the reason we were able to put this together was we had a set of images, and because they were from the Children's Oncology Group, we could link between the images and the clinical data, providing a data set nobody ever had before, which was a full set of CAT scans and MIBG images for neuroblastoma patients alongside the clinical data. So a lot of papers coming out, a lot of research in progress. And remember, each of these groups has their own defined set of rules for how people ask for data and how the attribution will be on papers and how they're published. So building standards into the workflow is going to be transformative. It gets us away from this manual extraction and all this information loss, all the errors that happen when you copy and paste from one place to the other, and the general lack of interoperability. Brian Ferner on our team estimates that 80% of the effort for a project is the transformation of the data. And if only we could have better standards, we would do things much faster and safer and better, because we wouldn't be spending so much effort just doing the data transformation. I want to close out with just one more really exciting piece of work that we're doing, is building something called Gearbox. So the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society came to us as part of their pediatric acute leukemia project and said, we need to fix the problem of kids not being able to find clinical trials at the time of relapse. And as you know, the traditional way of doing this is kids will have a relapse or a refractory disease, and then it can take weeks or months to find a trial to put that patient on. We wanted to solve that problem, and we stated the audacious goal of creating a system where a child can get on a phase 1 or 2 or 3 trial within 48 to 72 hours of being diagnosed with a relapse or refractory disease. And the way we did that is we created a platform that pulls all the clinical trials data out of clinicaltrials.gov and then creates an infrastructure where the clinician can then enter information about the patient and then actually be directed to open clinical trials that they can use. So here's what it looks like.
I have a question about that, actually,
Yeah.
Sam. So You know, when you go on clinicaltrials.gov, I actually find it like very rare where you actually see the data on the trial published. Or I mean, at least I have found very few trials, I think, when I've looked, where the actual like trial results are published. And so is that just because they just haven't taken that step to actually publish it again on clinical trials, or
Yeah, I mean, I think
where's that data gap happening? Like, is that data there, and then maybe you're getting it, it's just not getting back on the clinicaltrials.gov site? Or
I mean, so to be clear, we're really focused on the inclusion exclusion criteria to get kids on trials. But what I suspect is happening is that groups have some sort of obligation to post their trial to clinicaltrials.gov, but that's probably where their obligation ends. And the results are probably posted somewhere else, like in a publication or with the FDA. Because I bet that loop is not, I don't know this for sure, but
so they're sharing it somewhere, and you're likely getting it.
Well, I mean, you know, if it's a pharma company, they're sharing their results with the FDA, and if it's an investigator-initiated trial or children's oncology group trial, it's going to be published in a paper. Now, that paper may not come out for 10 years, which is the sad state of a lot of academic research, but it will be eventually shared and disseminated. And part of what we're doing is trying to shorten that time frame between the time the trial is done and when it's published. I think that's changing. I think there's a lot of pressure on people to get the data out now. But we scrape all the information off of clinicaltrials.gov. And then we create a very simple interface where the clinician, and this is open to the public, so the parents and families can do this too, just go in and start entering information that you know about the patient, and the trials will just sort, you know, match, non-match, potential match. And then you can actually look within the trial by clicking on it, and it will tell you why it's a match or why it's not a match. Maybe the creatinine is just a little bit too high, and it's nice to know that if it was just a little bit lower, the patient could get on the trial. And then critically important is this whole navigator idea, where this is AML, so Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has a navigator for patients with AML, but we actually want to build out a navigation system for all patients with cancer. And we just got funding to expand Gearbox to include all pediatric cancers, not just AML. So as part of that expansion, we hope to think about how to create a navigator system for all patients when they're a clinician or if they go through this process. I think the navigator part is really complicated because trying to work with a family and a clinician to identify which trials are the best and how to get the patient there, as you know, this is part of your business, is how do you create an easy way for patients to do that? So we could actually, that'd be a nice thing to spend more time on, is with you on this call, is to understand what are the easiest things that we could have impact on there. Ultimately, we want Gearbox to be less manual, so that the clinician could log in, and then their clinical data or molecular data would come in automatically, and then you could actually build a list of trials over time that the patient might be eligible for. And so part of our expansion through our 2 grants that we got to expand it is to build some of these more futuristic tools into the process, along with the governance it's going to take to implement those. So you know, we're thinking about things beyond pediatric cancer. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about any of them today, but what we've developed is really scalable to any area. You know, we take a data-first approach. We don't take any data until it's harmonized into a stable consensus format. A lot of groups will take data in and just hold on to it, and then they'll harmonize it later. We really feel like having a highly specific data dictionary that is built by the researchers allows us to put data into the commons that's highly useful right away. Balancing this autonomy and centralization is a real trick, because we want the data to be free, but we also know that if the data are too free, then people will stop putting data into the commons. So we have to really strike a balance there. The change management, understanding how do we change the dictionaries, how do we update the data, how do we make sure we have good quality control, super important. And then the governance is just critical. And we've started from square one by having a governance expert who works on our team, who works on all the aspects of data sharing, so that we make sure that everything we do is done through the right legal routes, and that everything is done through the right sharing agreements. So, you know, our motto has always been to envision a world where access to high quality data is never a barrier to improving human health. And that's not pediatric cancer focused. So over the next year, over the next 6 months, we're going to undergo a full rebranding to data for the common good. And Pediatric Cancer Data Commons is going to be the major part of that. But we want to also get across the point that what we're doing can help anybody who wants to share data, not just pediatric cancer data. And other groups that use the same strategy will certainly have downstream benefits back to pediatric cancer, because they will build tools and there will be better ways to share data that have effects on the pediatric cancer community. So we think that we're doing hopefully a good service worldwide by pushing these values out. So we think that the key to transforming human health is to create these data commons for rare diseases. And it's really built on a foundation of trust and sharing and collaboration. Having this consensus for building data dictionaries allows us to connect these disparate data types. And the earlier you can get people to do this, the better. If we weren't writing clinical trials in Microsoft Word and we were writing them in a clinical trials builder, we would eliminate so many of the downstream problems that we have. So we think that getting people to do as I said, make it easy to do the right thing by teaching them, by making these things freely available, is actually going to really help the whole pediatric cancer community. Our team is about 20. We have a lot of data standards, data science folks, programmers, project management team, legal, regulatory, and so forth. And I think we've built a really good recipe, and we've really loved working with the pediatric cancer researchers, and we hope to keep growing and expanding what we're doing. Our funding has so far been heavily weighted toward the St. Baldrick's and Leukemia Lymphoma Society and Raleigh Foundation, but there's been so many groups that have given us funding along the way. And then recently we've gotten some big funding from the National Cancer Institute, who's finally now, I think, seeing the value in funding these infrastructure work. But having foundation funding has been incredibly important to us, and we would never have gotten anywhere without the seed funding that we had as long ago as 7 years to start building these things. So that's all the prepared slides I had today. I think we have a lot of time for discussion, and I'm just very grateful for Christina for inviting me here today. I will say that the factor meeting I went to, and I'm not making this up, like, it was the best organized patient and researcher meeting I've ever been to, and I've been to a bunch of them. It was just so creative and thoughtful and engaging, and I've bragged about it to other groups, and I say, if you want to see a model of a great foundation meeting, this is one to look at. So I hope I get invited back again. And
thanks so much. We'd love to have you back.
Okay.
Great. Well, we do have some questions for the audience, but I just thank you so much. I mean, this is clearly such like fundamental, needed foundational work that makes all other research possible. And so important, everything you're doing. And it's so great that all this that you've invested into building this infrastructure and framework can be leveraged. And it's great that you have the vision to see that it can be leveraged outside even kind of the pediatric cancer world that you started with. So that's fantastic too.
I mean, it wasn't really our idea. I mean, the monogenic diabetes folks came to us and said, "Hey, can we have one of those?" And we're like, "Sure, we'll do that with you guys." So I don't see any direct.
Oh yeah, there. I think Kara will go ahead.
Is there a Q&A?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So we have a question. Sorry, we have a question that says, "Is your data commons for osteosarcoma for clinical data unique, or are there other competing efforts that will need to be sorted out in the future?"
It's a great question, and we get asked this a lot. As you know, there are other sources of data for different types of pediatric cancer. There's no doubt about that. And I think what we've built and what we're building is fairly unique. First, because it's based on highly specific needs of the research community. That's how we develop the standards. But second, because it's an international effort. And so we're not going to launch the osteosarcoma data commons with just COG data, because then that would just be COG. We're going to launch it with COG and hopefully St. Jude and maybe Dana-Farber, plus all of our European partners and hopefully UK partners. So I think what we're building is truly unique in this area. If there are other groups that have data sources for osteo, we would love to connect to them. We'd love to work with them. We'd love to know about them. And we don't want to reinvent any wheels. We want to have a combined effort. The hard part when you have multiple data sources is disambiguating the patients and figuring out who the same person is in two data sets. But we have technical and non-technical ways to do that, and we'd love to work with any groups that have data.
We have another question that says, "I couldn't agree more with you that the big tent philosophy is critical with such limited resources in this space. There are several efforts around data gathering happening today from the PCDC, COG, NCI's Childhood Cancer Data Initiative, and others. How are these working together to ensure we minimize the duplication of work? How are you coordinating with who owns it? Do you ultimately see everything ending up in one location?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the NCI is putting a lot of money into the Children's Cancer Data Initiative. There's going to be also trickle down from the NCI, from the Cancer Moonshot. And we don't want to reduplicate anything. And so I've taken a very active, somewhat aggressive role in trying to be part of the leadership for these groups. I'm on the CCDI steering committee. I'm going to be presenting at their big symposium coming up. I think having an eye on everything that's going on allows us to make sure that we're cooperating and not competing. The NCI is actually contracted with us to do all the data harmonization services for the clinical data commons that they're going to have, that's going to have the NCI sponsored clinical data. And we know that we're going to have a similar set of data, and we want to make sure that it's transparent to users, the kind of data we have versus what the NCI has and where the overlap is. So I think the only thing you can do is to try to make sure that you have eyes on everything and that you're paying attention to who's doing what. I think brain tumor is another great example where there's like 5 different consortia that were all working on different brain tumors. So we created an overarching consortium and brought everybody into it. That's the way I think having that big tent, I think, is what allows us to try to see everything. When people say, hey, did you notice that so-and-so has this big data set? I get excited because that potentially means another partner we can work with. And let's face it, if somebody's doing something better than we are, they should be doing it. I mean, it's not a competition. We just want to make researchers more successful. And so this is a long way to Oscar. This is a long way of just saying that we want to work with everybody. We want to make sure that we're not duplicating anything. We are coordinating we are coordinating what the governance is. We are making sure that people have the rights to access what they have and how we share it. And I'm happy to talk online or offline more about how we're trying to keep our eyes on everything. And then your second part of your question about how do we create more awareness of the work. I think the education initiatives we have are critically important. So spreading the word about these talks and sending out links to slide decks and to videos, and then getting involved. We're going to launch a parent advisory group, and we'd love to get other parents and families involved. And we're hopefully going to start with some patient-facing data collection tools like surveys and using patient-generated information. And that's another place where we'd love to have parent involvement.
On that topic, Sam, so I think some of the slides I saw mentioned the electronic health records, which I don't think anyone's kind of cracked that yet, but I think we're hopeful that will happen.
So we're involved in a number of pilots that are looking at pulling data out of the electronic health record. The problem with getting data out of EHRs is not so much a standards problem, it's an implementation problem. So every hospital's electronic health record is implemented slightly differently. So just because you know what your codes for male and female are, doesn't mean that you know where that variable sits within a hospital's infrastructure. And I didn't put these slides in, but if you look in, for instance, our University of Chicago's electronic health record, we have 32 hemoglobin values, and each of them is slightly different. And so how do you know which hemoglobin value is the one that you want to get out of the database? Not only that, let's say you want the hemoglobin when the patient starts chemotherapy. Well, is it the hemoglobin that they had in clinic? Is it the one that they had when they got to the hospital? Is it the one that they had after their transfusion? So there's a human factor involved there. And so that last mile problem of getting data out of EHRs is one that we haven't solved yet. And then we didn't even talk about free text and all the data that are buried in notes. So we're working on cracking that in an incremental way. We have a couple of pilots right now, and if people are interested in talking about EHR data extraction, we'd love to talk separately about that or get people involved in those efforts.
Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because I know specifically for osteo, for example, and I know that you're in touch with the osteosarcoma project. Because for osteosarcoma disease community, that's kind of the other kind of big data effort. So I think it's kind of like, okay, how do those work together? Because there's data going there. They're trying to get health records, though it is not electronic right now, right? It's like a very manual process. So it's just kind of like, how do those two things work together? But you're getting data from clinical trials, right? So
clinical trials and registries. But I think the next big wave is going to be not only EHR data, but patient-facing data. He's going because parents have such a rich trove of data on their kids, So having parents fill out parent surveys or patient surveys, but then something we rarely talk about is that parents can actually give, and then patients ultimately can give consent to having you access their electronic health records. There's third parties that will work with patients so that you go around the hospital system. And that for a long time, that was sort of a bad word, like you didn't do that. But I think we're getting to the point now where we want that rich EHR data, and we don't want to necessarily go through all the red tape that hospitals put up. And if parents want to consent to putting their data into a commons, they can do that separately. We just haven't done that.
So I'm wondering, like, what does that data set include for someone who's not really familiar with kind of like what's all the stuff collected in that record? So, you know, like just general stuff. I mean, like outcomes, obviously. And
yeah, but treatment data. We don't have treatment data. We don't know what drugs.
You don't have treatment data. Oh, sorry. I actually took for granted that you would have treatment data.
No, because most clinical trials don't collect it. They say what arm of the trial the patient was on. So you know,
right, but there's nothing in the
What we generally have is what treatment did we expect the patient to get? So then we don't actually have the drugs yet. And then if there's a deviation from the protocol, we don't have the reason why. So we not only do we not have why there was less methotrexate given, we don't have it was because the patient had an adverse event the last time. And that's like super rich data that's only in the EHR that we'll start to get at once we start to mine the electronic health record data.
Right. Okay. Because you actually had a slide towards the end where it kind of showed, it was kind of a matrix, and it kind of showed like different types of data, like patient-reported outcomes. And so those are all things that are not, because when we think of this data set, it's strictly whatever like is related to if you're enrolled on that trial.
Yeah, this is like, you know, comorbidities and stage of tumor and, you know, and event-free survival. I mean, it's dozens of elements, but it's very, you know, rank and file clinical trial data. I can't wait till we start to collect the rich EHR data, because it's just going to be an incredible amount of information in there. Ajay asked about accessing Girex without a Google account. We probably will need to set up alternative authentication mechanisms beyond Google. So far, it's obviously not 100%, but most people have some sort of connection to a Gmail account. It's obviously going to alienate some people, and we'll have to think about other ways for people to authenticate. Right now, the only way is using Google's authentication mechanism, but we certainly can take that as an important feedback that we need to think about another alternative form of identification.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say something that kind of came up in earlier today, and this kind of reminds me this could be a great application. Is you had mentioned registries, and I don't know, maybe you could talk about the different types of registries that kind of feed into this currently. But of particular note, particularly for a disease like osteo, where there is a lot of off-label drug usage that isn't being captured, like a way to potentially capture that information as well.
Yeah, I mean, registries are generally collected as part of either a research project or part of like, you know, like cancer registry data, like something that's state or locally mandated. They're rarely rich enough to answer highly technical research questions. The most common registries we see are researcher-generated registries, like I'm sure you're familiar with, where a researcher says, I want to capture all my patients, or I want to take patients from 5 institutions and put them in one place. Generally, it's a very manual process. The standards are usually not, they're often not done with consensus in mind. They're just generated by the researcher themselves. We're dipping our toes into registries first with germ cell tumor, because there's a bunch of germ cell registries, and then retinoblastoma because there aren't a lot of good clinical trials. Most of our data are registry related, but we'd love to, especially in the osteo community, if there are obvious registries for us to link to or to start to talk to about putting their data into the commons, we'd love to do that. Because the nice thing about registry data is that it's standardized to something, even if it's not the perfect standard, and then it can be converted often through technical means into your consensus data standard.
And I'm just curious so knowing what the source of data is, it's all these different groups who have clinical trials. So what % of clinical trials are captured, do you think, by, let's say, at least the current 9 partners that you have for osteo? So knowing that there's like other trials that happen outside those organizations.
I would think that if there's a clinical trial in the US and Western Europe or the UK, that it's done under the auspices of one of these cooperative groups. I think where you might miss out are pharma-sponsored trials.
Mm-hmm.
So purely pharma-sponsored trials. And I don't know the breakdown. That's like more of a Katie Janeway question, but I would assume that the vast majority of clinical trials are cooperative group driven for pediatrics. And that the number of, I think if you have kids on pharma trials, it's probably adult drugs that are being extended down to age 12 or 14, like we're seeing with some of the adult drugs. So we're trying to capture, we have a proposal in now to try to capture some long-term follow-up data on kids on pharma trials. And if that goes forward, that might give us access to a rich data set for kids on pharma trials. But I bet we're going to capture most of the clinical trial data. But remember, a lot of kids, it sounds like they go on trial, but they're really not. They're being treated as per a trial, as per the last known regimen, because a lot of hospitals can't afford or just don't have the trials open. And so in those cases, those kids get treated as per a trial, and then those data might not be captured at all. We have to figure out a way to get at those data.
Right. Which I guess is, yeah, that's,
I mean, the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative is, what is their tagline? To maximize data from every child with cancer. So we can't rely, as much as COG has been an incredible partner for us, we can't rely on COG to be the answer, because they're only capturing, 60 whatever % of kids who have cancer. And so we need to really make sure we're going to the hospitals themselves. And that's what CCDI is doing now through the Molecular Characterization Initiative and through some of the other work, is making sure that whether the kids in COG or not, that we can still capture their data.
Right. So is the idea that, and kind of back to Oscar's question, that through some of these other efforts, let's say CCDI or the other places where they're starting to capture like the actual health record data, treatment and side effects and all of that, that could then marry with the data that's in the data commons?
We actually want to get those data. So we're talking with Adam Resnick about brain tumor data that he's collecting, where we can be the clinical partner, he can be the genomic partner. We don't need to be the repository for all data, but we certainly can be if it needs a home. It really comes down to who has the rights to share the data. And I think you mentioned before, and I think that's the thread that runs through this, is who owns the data. It's not clear. If the NCI sponsors the trial through the COG, who ultimately owns those data? Is it the patient? Is it the hospital? Is it the NCI? So far, we're working through a mechanism where COG has the right to share the data, and that's how we get the data. But that's a really fundamental question that needs to be answered as we start to wade into these waters of sharing data at the EHR level.
Right.
I mean, the European regulations state that if a patient decides they don't want their data in a database at any time, they have the right to ask for it to be removed. Mm-hmm. If you've de-identified the data, they can still ask for it to be removed. And how do you remove that patient's data? So there's a lot of tough questions to answer right now about privacy and data protection and data ownership.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, OS Project is trying to address that through, because they're going through the patient, right? They're basically saying, patient, you just like authorize permission for us to have access to your records. Again, it's not EHR, but it's that route where the patient basically can give permission to say, yes, use my data.
Right, but even then, it has to be very broad consent, because when you build a new data set, like connecting clinical, genomic, and imaging data together, maybe nobody's ever thought of that data set before. And so how do you know you have consent to build this new data set that may identify the patient in a way that was not conceived before? Another talk I gave recently, somebody brought up the point that, parents just want their kids' data shared. And it made me remember that the angriest I've ever seen a parent about data sharing was when their child's data couldn't be shared. And that's a really difficult, uncomfortable conversation to have, is when you say, we couldn't use your kid's tumor biopsy. And they say, why? And they say, because we did the consent after the surgery had started, therefore we're not allowed to use it.
Oh, wow.
Man, that's a tough conversation to have, and that parent is like, why can't we use it? I'm telling you, you can use it. So I think aligning these things of like the expectation of privacy is super important. And we want to make sure that patients' data are protected, but parents and patients want their data shared really badly. So how do we align those expectations together? Is we're, obviously groups like MIB agents are so important because you bring all these groups together to talk about these things.
Yeah, and that's definitely kind of a key role that we as a patient community can play in moving research forward, right? Like we have the goods, we can give you like access to the goods to be able to generate that data. So yeah. Back again, also to kind of the point that Oscar brought up and the whole portal thing. Are you familiar with the Osteosarcoma Explorer?
Yeah.
Because that's another, so how is that? Because that's kind of similar idea, right? Where it's a portal where researchers can then use that portal to access different data sets. And I think the data sets they're having there, it says it's like from COG, Target, CBioPortal.
Yeah, no, and we worked with that group at UT Southwest initially to understand some of the needs of the osteosarcoma community. And they based that off of their Lung Explorer that they had built. It's a very talented informatics team at UT Southwest. But I mean, those data are not, they're not updated with recent outcomes. I don't think they have the current data sharing agreements in place. I could be wrong, but I don't think they have the current sharing agreements in place with COG to get updated outcomes data. I think, I don't think that their dictionary was consensus driven the way that our dictionary is, which allows us to, harmonize data over multiple data types. But it's a beautiful platform, and we worked with them initially to understand if we could share some of the graphical elements and ways to put data into the portal. So I think, again, I'm aware of that effort, and I know her really well, and happy to work with anybody who has something similar.
Well, it just sounds like another great collaboration opportunity, because it's kind of like different, like there's this great portal that exists, but maybe it's just connecting it to the right.
Yeah, and they're hardcore bioinformaticians who know how to do analytics in the browser. And so we actually were on a grant together maybe it was like 3 or 4 years ago, like trying to share some of the knowledge we had around building in-browser analytics. I want to make sure, can we just answer Oscar's last question real quick? Because I love this question about how do we get data from some of the larger institutions. So this has been for the longest time, we couldn't get data from St. Jude. It was a huge problem. And then like something clicked, like we hit some sort of critical mass, and all of a sudden the data sharing agreement started to get signed. And so hopefully in the next, again, it's a harmonization issue, but the Hodgkin data are ready and AML data are ready, and those should be the first to come out of St. Jude. And then we're going to be getting ALL data from Dana-Farber for one of their Dana-Farber trials. So I think the big institutions that are not COG are going to come, and I'm not sure what turns the tide. Maybe it's service, maybe it's FOMO. I don't know what it is, but I think eventually we start to see people wanting to come along. I think there's also trust that's being built in as we start to do more and more of these. But if you have other ideas, we'd love to work on them together.
That is fantastic. I don't think we have any other questions right now. And thank you everyone for engaging and for your wonderful questions. And we are at about time. So thank you so much, Sam, for joining us on Osteobites today and for making it better for pediatric cancer patients everywhere. More information on this and all Osteobites can be found on YouTube, on our website at mibagents.org, and at your favorite podcast place. And I should also say that because Sam did present at Factor, we do have his presentation up on our YouTube playlist. And so if you want to get like a little bit more background on PCDC, there is a great presentation there already. And join us next Thursday on the 13th. We're going to be talking to Dr. Michael Kinnaman. He's a pediatric oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering and a member of the, I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing this, Iocabuzio Donahue Lab. And he is going to be talking to us about how osteosarcoma evolves from diagnosis to relapse. And you can find the rest of our lineup for 2022 on our website. And if you have any ideas of other topics you'd like to hear about on Osteobites, feel free to share them with us at events@mibagents.org. Thanks so much, Sam, for spending an hour with us today. And thank you, Kara. And thank you to our sponsor, BTG Specialty Pharmaceuticals. And thank you all for joining us today on Osteobites. And we hope to see you next week when we chat with Dr. Kinnaman. Thanks, and have a good rest of the week.